Coming up in this episode, we're going to dive into graphical adventure games by taking a look at the early adventure games by Roberta and Ken Williams. Talk about the evolution of adventure games from text parsers to point-and-click experiences, and highlight a few of the lesser-known 1980s graphical adventure games you should definitely check out. I'm Sean Jordan, and I am your great game guide. Let's see what one of computer gaming's earliest showcase genres has in store. I grew up as a PC gamer, largely because my parents made my brothers and I skip out on the Nintendo Entertainment System when it arrived, and PC games were all we had to play. We did have an Atari 2600 when I was really young, but when our TV started going on the fritz, my dad blamed it on the Atari, and that was pretty much the end of console gaming in our house. And my dad was so adamantly against the slop on TV that he got rid of cable on our family television, and we were pretty much restricted to watching what was on local networks or whatever we could find on VHS. PG rated, of course. For a lot of people, this would have probably been a good signal to go outside, get some fresh air, explore the world around them, and I did. But we lived in the Midwest, where it got way too cold in the winter and way too warm in July, so there were many days where we were stuck indoors trying to find something to do. And since our computer time was limited to just half an hour each day, we'd usually burn through that before lunchtime. Being a PC gamer, one of the genres my brothers and I played a lot were adventure games, and it might have had a shaping influence on how we all think. Because when I was a teenager, my brother and I figured out how to utilize an old RGB monitor to essentially become a TV, and that meant we could hook up a video game console. An absolutely perfect plan, because we had friends who were getting tired of their Super Nintendos and Sega Genesises and willing to sell them to us or even give them to us. And they worked great on that RGB monitor. What was particularly interesting about this workaround was that my parents didn't fight us on it. We weren't taking up the TV downstairs and preventing them from watching whatever they wanted, and we weren't doing anything that might harm the TV, and we weren't monopolizing the computer. Somehow, we had solved this really illogical, arbitrary puzzle, and the reward was getting to graduate from being exclusively PC gamers to getting to be console gamers as well. I've had many situations in my life that are just like that, and I credit adventure games for teaching me to think outside the box. And for me, the adventures that were the most gripping weren't the text-based games we covered in the last two episodes. It was the graphical ones, where you didn't have to imagine what was happening around you from a bunch of text, but you could actually see things depicted on the screen and interact with the game world directly. The first adventure games I recall actually seeing were the trio of King's Quest III, Space Quest, and Leisure Suit Larry in the Land of the Lounge Lizards, and that's because at the base exchange on the Air Force Base I lived on, those three games were running on a non-playable demo loop on the computers in the electronics department. I was captivated by them because each game featured its own world in which the characters could freely move around in what seemed like 3 dimensions due to the perspective. They could pick things up, and they could talk to other characters. That might not seem like a big deal today, but in the mid-1980s, when a lot of games were side-scrollers or overhead action games with single-button inputs, the difference was incredible. And what's more, I liked fantasy, and I liked science fiction, so King's Quest and Space Quest were right up my alley. As for Leisure Suit Larry, dancing with girls in a disco, not so much of an interest for a kid in the first grade. But I remember being really curious what a lounge lizard was, and being only 6 or 7 at the time, I had a pretty literal understanding of what that might mean. It wasn't until I was a little older, hit puberty, and the themes of Leisure Suit Larry were suddenly very interesting to me, that I had the wisdom and maturity to understand figurative language. And sleaze, which Leisure Suit Larry delighted in, though I maintain to this day that the game's not nearly as filthy as people made it out to be, and that it was actually a parody of all of those truly sleazy XXX adult games and graphics discs you'd see advertised in computer magazines. If you know the history of Leisure Suit Larry, you know I'm actually not far off the mark either, because it was both a parody and a remake of an earlier 1981 text-only adventure game called Soft Porn Adventure, published by a company called Online Systems. The game was written by Charles Benton in BASIC for the Apple II, and Benton happened to meet an enterprising software publisher at a trade show who eventually decided to help him reach a wider audience. The game's box art features a now infamous cover where 3 nude women are sitting in a hot tub sipping champagne while a mustachioed waiter stands behind them with a tray and a bottle. Just the hint of sex and nudity in a computer game was shocking enough for the 1980s, a time when the moral majority was in full force trying to censor anything even remotely provocative. But there's an even more interesting detail about this cover. 2 of the women, on the left, worked for Online Systems. Their names are Diane Siegel and Suzanne Davis. But the 3rd woman, sitting alone on the right, has long brown hair and bangs. And it's not only her home in which the photo for this cover was taken, but also her influence that led to the rise of graphical adventure games as one of the genres through which video game stories could be told. Her face is very familiar to gamers today, and her name is Roberta Williams. She and her husband, Ken Williams, co-founded Online Systems 2 years before this version of Soft Porn Adventure debuted. While they'd started the company to write business software, they'd also used it to publish Roberta's hobby project, a game called Mystery House, in 1980. It kicked off a series called High-Res Adventures that would become the very foundation for graphical adventure games, not just in the United States, but around the world. I don't know if you saw it in early 2023, but a company nobody had heard of called Cygnus Entertainment released a game called Colossal Cave that offered a full 3D remake of Will Crowther and Don Woods' adventure. And with graphics, of course, since the original game didn't even have those. You can even play it in VR if you want, which is a pretty amazing option given that the game it's based on is now 50 years old. The Steam page lists Colossal Cave as being by the award-winning designer of King's Quest and Phantasmagoria. And no, that is not a fake-out. The remake was directed by Roberta Williams, creator of both of those games, as Cygnus Entertainment is co-owned by her and her husband, Ken. And it makes sense that they'd put out a visual reimagining of Colossal Cave Adventure because, as Roberta Williams says herself, this is the game that inspired her to become a game developer. And, by the way, this leads me to want to add a little bit of detail to the story of the creation of Adventure, because I was not aware until I watched Roberta Williams' video about the origins of Colossal Cave Adventure that Will Crowther had originally mapped the caves in the Mammoth Cave system with his wife, Patricia. In fact, it was Patricia who first discovered the passageway linking the Mammoth Cave to the nearby Flint Cave system. And the two worked together to digitize their maps on a teletype terminal they had at home connected to the PDP-1 at Will's workplace. So why does Will get so much credit for mapping the caves? It was probably because the two separated before he wrote the game that made his exploration of them famous. But it just goes to show, behind every major accomplishment made by a man, there's usually a woman who deserves more credit. That's never been the case with Ken and Roberta Williams, though. They're gaming's first true power couple, and they are absolutely fascinating people who had a powerful shaping effect on the modern video game industry, particularly in the United States and Japan, but also in Germany and Eastern Europe, where point-and-click adventure games never really fell out of fashion like they did in most of the rest of the world. You could make a whole movie about them, and in fact, somebody is doing that. Later this year, there's going to be a documentary film called The Legends of Adventure, the story of Sierra Online, coming out, for which, I'm happy to say, I was a proud Kickstarter backer. Maybe one day they'll inspire a biopic about their young lives together as business-minded programmer and a wildly creative game designer, trying to get away from it all and make amazing computer games they sell in Ziploc baggies from their home at the foot of the Sierra Mountains. But to those of us who have been following the PC gaming scene for a while, the story of how Ken and Roberta founded Online Systems and then pivoted to Sierra Online is actually pretty well known because they were both so willing to give interviews during the 1980s and 90s, and they also published their own company magazine. What's more, a lot of the people who were there and worked with them have also given lots of interviews, so we have a pretty clear picture today of what working at Sierra was like. But let's back up to 1979 when Ken Williams discovered a game called Colossal Cave Adventure and introduced it to his wife, Roberta. They were both captivated by the game, and Roberta started searching for others like it. She tried out other games like Scott Adams' Adventureland, but both she and Ken felt the experience could be improved with graphics. Unfortunately, the microcomputers of the day weren't very good at displaying detailed graphics for a few important reasons. One of these was storage. The cassettes and discs of the day were low density and had very serious limitations when it came to storing both images and programs. Another was the graphics hardware itself on home computer platforms, which was still quite primitive and also not standardized. And then there was also the issue of memory. Some platforms required games to load entirely into RAM before they could be played because the storage media were too slow to read from during the game itself. This was particularly a problem with cassette tapes. But Roberta and Ken recognized that the Apple II was capable of displaying hand-drawn graphics in conjunction with a tool called VersaWriter that allowed users to trace physical images placed on a drawing board and then digitize the tracing in medium or high-resolution formats. This is an important detail because the games this husband and wife duo were about to create would come to be known as the high-res adventures. And even though the games are laughably low resolution by today's standards, in 1980 computer graphics of any sort were still a very novel idea, particularly on a home computer. But the VersaWriter had a big limitation, and that was that the out-of-the-box software was only used for digitizing images, not actually displaying them in games. So Ken Williams had to write software to allow the Apple II to actually display them, and he also rewrote the scanning software to improve upon it. And when Roberta created 70 drawings for the game she was writing, he had to additionally write software to compress and display them during the game, which meant reinterpreting the lines in the graphics like vectors with coordinates. This led to an effect that became common in the high-res adventures of seeing the computer draw each scene whenever you'd enter a room, which slowed the action down considerably from the faster pace of text-based adventure games. This slowdown became even more tedious when subsequent entries in the series added color graphics that had to be filled in once the objects were drawn. But we won't focus on how clunky Mystery House feels today, because in 1980, it was a revolutionary title, allowing players to explore a Victorian mansion populated by 7 other people, each of whom would get killed one by one by the murderer in their midst. Roberta Williams took inspiration from the Agatha Christie novel And Then There Were None, a style of mystery we today call a thriller because it involves a hidden murderer picking off people one by one while the others are still trying to solve the case. I also need to pause here and add that Christie's book is not one I would recommend to modern readers unless you're clear-eyed that the book was originally called 10 Little N-Words, and that it's built around the 19th century minstrel song of the same name. Some versions change their name to 10 Little Indians, which is not any better, or 10 Little Soldiers, which help to sanitize it somewhat, but the book is steeped in cultural racism that isn't so easily sanitized with a name change. Fortunately, Mystery House doesn't have any of these problems, and Roberta Williams also took inspiration from the board game Clue, or Cluedo if you're from outside the United States, to make the gameplay comprehensible to players. The result is an adventure game that is tremendously interesting for its time because it's able to evoke a sense of ratcheting terror as you begin to find bodies and messages from the killer around the house. Eventually, you can find and confront the killer and escape, which is good because no one else survives the story. But if there's one thing to knock Mystery House for, it's that the game is so brief. So much so that once you figure out the correct range of actions, you can complete it in under 15 minutes. Even so, Mystery House was a showcase title for the Apple II in 1980, and if you were in the United States, that was where you were going to play it. Ken and Roberta Williams were surprised to discover that there was an audience for it, and the game sold thousands of copies. Not bad for a hobby game that only took them about a month to code. This also gave Roberta Williams the opportunity to work on a follow-up that could be bigger and better, and we'll get to that in a moment. But before we do, I want to offer a few comments about Mystery House that might help those who weren't around during the early days of computing, and hey, I was a wee babe myself at that time, to understand just how foundational of a game it is. First of all, I want you to think about just how many games you've played that involve exploring a house or a village full of unfolding horrors and trying to solve puzzles while you also evade bad guys. I can name a few just off the top of my head. Alone in the Dark, Resident Evil, Silent Hill, Eternal Darkness Sanity's Requiem, Gone Home, The Vanishing of Ethan Carter, What Remains of Edith Finch. All of these games owe a tremendous debt to Mystery House for establishing the rules and format of their gameplay. And lest you think I'm overstating the importance of Mystery House, there's one place where the game was widely ported, and that was in Japan. And this is a rather important detail too, because Mystery House was huge there, both in its original form and also in a pseudo-remake by Microcabin in 1982 that simplified the story. There was also a sequel by Microcabin called Mystery House 2, and a remake in 1983 by a developer called StarCraft that included redrawn graphics. Because Japanese computers tended to have higher resolution display capabilities to display Japanese written characters, graphical adventures were a natural fit for the various platforms in Japan, and were widely played by the emerging game developers and computer programmers who were part of Japan's young PC gaming industry. Second, I want to point out that Mystery House was quite different from the many text-based adventures that would emerge in the early 1980s because the gameplay was dependent upon those graphics to create atmosphere and tension. Most text-based games that included graphics could easily be played without them, but in Mystery House, the text descriptions alone were not very evocative of the action, and the game probably wouldn't have been as much fun without the opportunity it granted to see the house from a first-person perspective, and to stumble across visual representations of in-game items, freshly dug graves, and of course, dead bodies. And if you want to see a comparison, there is another text-based adventure game based on the same novel that isn't nearly as fun as Mystery House. Finally, Mystery House helped adventure gaming break free of the more open treasure hunting framework of Will Crowther's adventure and add some direction to the gameplay with a more linear story to experience. This turned out to be both a good and bad thing for the genre, and if there's one thing graphical adventure games are particularly well known for even today, it's what lousy value they are once you know the solutions to their puzzles. They tend to be easier to solve than text-based adventure games and often have to add in serious padding like scripted sequences, cheap deaths, arcade action minigames, and lots of dialogue to ensure that the games can't be completed in 15 minutes like Mystery House can be. But you know what? We're getting ahead of ourselves. And before we start talking about all the games Ken and Roberta Williams would eventually become known for, we need to talk about another high-res adventure that would form the scaffolding for their far more famous series about King Graham's adventures in Daventry. Before Graham could take his first King's Quest, Roberta Williams had a story to tell about a wizard and a princess. Roberta Williams grew up loving fairy tales and fantasy storytelling, and it's fitting that her next game after Mystery House turned out to be an adventure in the kingdom of Serenia, a world of myth and magic where players took on the role of a wandering hero tasked by King George to rescue Princess Priscilla from the castle of the evil wizard Harlan. If some of these details sound familiar, it's because Roberta Williams would later recycle some of this plot and even the land of Serenia itself in her later and more famous adventure game series, King's Quest. But whereas King's Quest was a fairly impressive game graphically for its time, this earlier title, initially known as Wizard and the Princess, is quite a bit less so. I don't want to pick on the game's artwork because the game is from 1980 and was produced in a manner similar to Mystery House, where hand-drawn pictures were digitally traced, but I don't think it's unfair to say that they are crude. The biggest difference is that they're also in color, which was accomplished on the Apple II original using a process called dithering to display a broader palette of colors on screen than the hardware was actually capable of. For 1980, having full-color graphics in an adventure game was pretty revolutionary, even if the graphics themselves weren't particularly impressive. And when you consider that the competition included games like Zork and the Adventureland series, Ken and Roberta Williams definitely looked like they were on the cutting edge, and there's no question that they pushed the graphical adventure genre way forward. But one problem with Wizard and the Princess was that the game was amazingly challenging despite its seeming accessibility, designed for more advanced adventure gamers rather than people just starting out. I personally don't recommend it without a walkthrough because there are puzzles you will absolutely not solve on your own without beating your head against the wall, including one part where you have to enter a specific word that isn't obvious and which requires some serious magical thinking to divine. Roberta Williams would later pull something even more baffling with an infamous puzzle in King's Quest in 1985, but we'll get to that in a bit. The challenge was high enough that Ken and Roberta added another entry to their high-res adventures line, making it part 0 in the series. This game, Mission Asteroid, offered new players a more linear storyline with straightforward puzzles to solve as they attempted to launch a rocket to intercept and blow up an asteroid heading towards the Earth. While not a terribly compelling game on its own, It completed the initial triad of high-res adventures and gave online systems some breathing room to start working on something bigger and better. Now here's where things get interesting. Roberta Williams got to work on a 6-month project that would eventually take up most of 1981 and include an additional 10-person development team to help her build her most ambitious game yet. A 6-disc, $99 adventure game with 1,300 locations to visit and a dedicated telephone helpline to offer hints. This game, Time Zone, was technically the 5th game in the high-res adventure series, but for whatever reason, it dropped the branding of high-res adventures on the actual box. It was also an enormous flop of an adventure. $99 in 1982 was about $350 in today's dollars, and even worse, Time Zone was incredibly tedious. Having well over 1,000 locations to visit while using a text parser built for 2-word verb and noun commands, and the thrill of using a time machine to visit other periods in history weren't quite as exciting as it sounded. The illustrations were also still quite cartoony and crude. Better than The Wizard and the Princess, to be sure, but not anywhere near the level of other graphical adventure games that it was meant to compete with, like Ultrasoft's The Mask and the Sun, Penguin Software's Spooky Transylvania, or even Scott Adams' graphic adventure line that added graphics to his text-based adventures. But what about the other high-res adventure games that came out before Time Zone, you may be wondering? Neither was developed by Roberta Williams, so they tend to be kind of forgotten. Number 3 in the series was called Cranston Manor, a graphical adaptation of an earlier Atari 8-bit text adventure written by Larry Ledden. The full-color artwork adds a little value to the game, and it actually looks better than the art of any of Roberta Williams' high-res adventures, but the gameplay is still based on that simplistic adventure trope of plundering a game world of an arbitrary number of treasures. In this case, a rich man's mansion. High-res adventure number 4 was created by Bob Davis, a liquor store employee from Oakhurst who Ken Williams hired to not only create this game, but also later help out with Time Zone. Interestingly, this game is called Ulysses and the Golden Fleece, and if you know anything about Greek and Roman mythology, this title's already problematic because it's a hodgepodge of names and myths from different traditions. The cover art also shows Ulysses riding Pegasus, which, no, that's not how things went down. Maybe if Ulysses had actually met Pegasus during the course of the Odyssey, he wouldn't have been stuck stranded at sea for 10 years. He could have gotten back and seen Penelope and Telemachus. Suffice it to say that this adventure isn't too worried about staying true to its source material. If you can let all that go, what you'll find is a thoroughly average text adventure with graphics not particularly special, but certainly playable. If you know your mythology, most of the puzzles aren't too difficult, though there is a rather strange sequence where you have to lash your ship to a fjord and bribe a dragon to go away, which just feels like Ulysses has stepped into the Norse tradition somehow. There are also puzzles with magic words you have to figure out and an ocean that behaves like a maze. Definitely play it with a walkthrough if you try it out today. The final high-res adventure game debuted in 1983, and of all of them, it's the one I recommend you play today. It's also the first title to use Online Systems' new name, Sierra, in its branding, this time calling itself a Sierra Venture. The name of the game? The Dark Crystal, based on the feature film of the same name. The movie The Dark Crystal came out in 1982 and was an ambitious dark fantasy film co-directed by Jim Henson and Frank Oz that was notable for featuring only puppets and animatronics with no on-screen human actors. It's a profoundly strange and visually striking film that today would be made easily with computer graphics, but then had to be done entirely with practical effects that pushed the talented puppeteers beyond previous productions like The Muppet Show, The Muppet Movie, and Sesame Street, all the way to their limits. The story, which involves a young gelfling boy named Jen setting out on a quest to heal an ancient crystal and stop the evil bird-like beings known as the Skeksis, is actually the weakest part of the film. Even so, it allows for an adventure that moves from strange location to even stranger location, eventually introducing a second Gelfling character named Kira and sending the two across a vast and surreal world, riding on giant creatures called Landstriders. It all leads to a terrifying castle where the Skeksis are about to gain ultimate power as 3 suns converge in the sky, unless Jen and Kira can restore the crystal. All of this makes for a pretty weird movie, but it also makes for a great adventure game, especially when that game depicts the considerable artistry of the film in each of its scenes. And that's exactly what Ken and Roberta Williams elected to do with their adaptation of The Dark Crystal, a fairly linear and straightforward adaptation of the feature film that nonetheless looks and plays well because it relies on so much of the movie's story and assets. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that the game improves upon the film's story by cutting it down to the most important action and then makes smart use of the production art and film scenes to depict the best moments of the action. It's almost like playing an interactive storybook based on the movie, and because it wasn't particularly kid-friendly in its design, Sierra had Al Loke recreate the game in a new version called Gelfling Adventure that debuted in 1984 as something that could be marketed towards schools. A more modern version of the game also exists on the website darkcrystal.com with updated graphics and a simplified text parser that allows you to know which actions you can take at any point. In about 5 minutes, you can experience the entire story, and that was a criticism at the time, too. For a game that spanned 3 discs and had such strong production values, it sure was short and easy. But let's talk about why this game is important for a moment. First of all, The Dark Crystal was one of the first licensed video games to ever exist, and certainly one of the first graphical adventure games ever built as an official tie-in to a feature film. When you compare it to other popular licensed titles of the day, like Raiders of the Lost Ark, The Empire Strikes Back, and E.T. the Extraterrestrial on the Atari 2600, Sierra's The Dark Crystal really stands out for capturing the look and feel of the film and truly immersing players into the movie's world without taking major liberties with the characters or the plot. There's also the fact that Sierra recognized that it needed to make the game easier and more accessible for younger audiences, and it led to a third style of Roberta Williams adventure games that Sierra would go on to publish for years: educational games for children, which she'd begin making again just a few years later with her 1987 graphical adventure Mixed Up Mother Goose. Combine that with her mysteries like The Colonel's Bequest, The Dagger of Amon-Ra, and Phantasmagoria, and her long-running fantasy-based King's Quest games, and you get a tremendous and varied run of adventure games that demonstrate that, time zone aside, Roberta Williams absolutely knew her stuff when it came to adventure gaming. But in 1983, nobody really understood the business of gaming that well, and Sierra made a lot of mistakes, one of which included The Dark Crystal. Trusting in the reputation of Jim Henson and the Hollywood film industry, Ken and Roberta had anticipated the game would be a big seller that would bring them and the fledgling computer game industry broader exposure, and unfortunately, it just wasn't the game to do that. The bigger problem, however, was that Sierra had also gotten into the cartridge market for home computers, primarily for computer platforms like the VIC-20, Atari 8-bit, and Apple II that were all about to get absolutely slaughtered by the Commodore 64, which would become a dominant format in North America for gaming. Suddenly, they had a lot of expensive inventory they couldn't sell and very little to offer in a world where game consoles were crashing and home computers were realigning. Sierra cut its staff down from 100 people to about 20 to 30, and Ken and Roberta had to find ways to keep the company afloat by taking out personal loans, including mortgaging their new $800,000 home. During all of this, there were discussions about how to keep Sierra solvent. One idea was for them to merge with Spinnaker Software, the educational software company responsible for many Apple II games you'd find in school computer labs. Spinnaker, as we know from a previous episode of the show, eventually did get into the text-based adventure gaming business along with Byron Price by later establishing a label that would be known as Telerium. But Roberta Williams didn't think much of them, and Ken Williams even says in his book that she protested that they were a joke of a publisher, not taken seriously within the computer software industry, and she opposed any merger with them. I want to pause here and say that Sierra was one of the many publishers that would have gone under in 1983 if it hadn't gotten profoundly lucky with what happened next. When you read the company's history, there are several times where it appears that Ken Williams may have made business decisions that led to a costly detour or held the company back, while Roberta, as the creative force, was the one who pushed the company forward. On the other hand, Roberta was also the person who had the most clout and who got the most support whenever she had a game to ship, an issue that did impact other creators at Sierra whenever they wanted their games to be more visible. I personally think that Sierra needed both of their personalities to provide a sort of yin and yang to help them weather the constant storms that Sierra would face during the many changes occurring in the world of microcomputers and home video console systems. It's really hard when you're in a newer industry to anticipate where the future is heading because things change so quickly, and Sierra placed both good and bad bets along the way. In later interviews, Roberta has always said that while Ken is a great salesman and businessman, he's also more trusting of other people than she is, And that did lead to situations where he made some business deals that he probably shouldn't have, including one 15 years later that would wind up with the Williamses losing control of the business entirely. But back in 1983, with no sustainable revenue and a lot of personal capital on the line, Sierra might have vanished if it hadn't been for a fortunate side deal Ken Williams worked out with IBM to create software for their new PC Junior platform, including a brand new adventure game that would be built around the idea of replayability and showcase a more dynamic, complex game world than the simple room-to-room adventure game designs driven by text interactions that Sierra had been utilizing. IBM had plenty of funding and wanted their new format to succeed, and so Sierra had enough runway to create something revolutionary and new. It took them 18 months to do it, and as I'm sure we all know, that's exactly what they did. The idea Ken and his associate Jeff Stevenson ultimately pitched was an adventure game that would de-emphasize text to the point that the parser would only be used for specific commands. The player would use arrow keys to walk around a game world made up of interconnected screens, and what would happen on those screens would be dynamic and different, with characters who'd wander around and action sequences that would occur, and the gameplay would be animated. After some convincing back at Sierra, Roberta Williams decided to lead the team in designing this game, and Jeff Stevenson, with some guidance from Ken, wrote the tool called the Adventure Game Interpreter, or AGI, that would be used to program it. This new tool would once again use hand-drawn graphics traced into a digital format and then be drawn on screen using vectors, allowing the game to make good use of precious disk space. But it would also feature a controllable, playable character who could move left, right, up, or down on each screen and be stopped by boundaries and objects that fit the scene. The result was King's Quest: Quest for the Crown, a fairy tale-inspired game where a knight named Sir Graham, originally spelled with an E on the end, is tasked by King Edward with retrieving 3 hidden treasures from the land around the Kingdom of Daventry to resolve the disasters and hardship everyone is facing. After the PC Junior original released in May of 1984, Sierra released several new versions that gradually expanded the backstory and made some changes to the storyline. Sir Graham lost the E at the end of his name, and the king's name was changed to King Edward the Benevolent, and the quest was now about defeating an evil witch who had tricked the king and absconded to the nearby land of Cumberland with 3 treasures. This is the version of the story most players will remember, particularly since it's offset with several other villainous foes, including a giant, a troll, an ogre, a dragon, and a leprechaun king, as well as an old gnome with an extremely difficult-to-guess name. And no, it's not Rumpelstiltskin, but you do need to figure that much out to deduce his real name. There are also other creatures wandering around like birds, elves, goats, and wolves. Now, if you play the classic King's Quest game today, you'll probably be playing the MS-DOS remake from 1987 with EGA graphics, or the 1990 remake with the newer Sierra Creative Interpreter, or SCI, game engine. If you somehow manage to track down the old PC Junior or Tandy 1000 version, you may be surprised at how much slower it is to play because the game has to draw all the background graphics before allowing Graham to move around the screen. But even that version, when compared to other games of the era, stands out as being an incredibly groundbreaking game. In 1984, seeing King's Quest in action and comparing it to the games that had come before, it was similar to seeing the jump between Nintendo's Donkey Kong or Mario Brothers and the later Super Mario Brothers. It was a revelation of what games could become, but it was also the first graphical adventure game to establish a style fully dependent on the graphics, not just to replace some of the text description, but to allow players to navigate and interact with the game world. King's Quest is also where the most distinctive facet of the graphical adventure game genre, being in exactly the right spot to use an intended action, came into play. Skills that had been crucial for previous adventure games, like mapping and using inventory items as breadcrumbs, were not nearly as important in King's Quest as they had been in more abstract adventures of the imagination. But learning how the game world's more dynamic elements responded to the player and understanding what the graphics were saying about where you could go and what you could do, those skills suddenly became far more critical. But for all its originality, King's Quest was not an immediate hit because it was tied too closely to the failed PC Junior platform. Fortunately, the game got a second life on the Tandy 1000 and became one of its showcase games. Sierra also ported the game to the Apple IIe and IIc, though players needed to upgrade their RAM to 128 kilobytes to play King's Quest on the IIe, which could easily cost another $80 to $100 in the mid-1980s, at least a couple of $100 in today's dollars. King's Quest also made its way to the Amiga, the Atari ST, the Macintosh, and even the Sega Master System. Interestingly, Sierra did not support the Commodore 64 with King's Quest or any other game in the AGI series because the system didn't have the graphical chops or memory needed to display the game properly. As a result, the Sierra adventure games were far more popular in North America than they were overseas, where they weren't ported to many of the popular Japanese or European formats. But in North America, they were the foundation of an entire series of games, not just including King's Quest, but also the aforementioned Space Quest, and Police Quest, and Quest for Glory, and yes, Leisure Suit Larry as well. Sierra knew it had a good thing going, and Roberta Williams and the development team began work on King's Quest II, Romancing the Throne, an ambitious sequel that had Graham, now King of Daventry, head to the land of Kalima to rescue a woman named Valanice from a crystal tower. While the setup sounds very similar to Wizard and the Princess, the gameplay had a lot more going on, allowing Graham to encounter an evil witch and Dracula and Neptune and mermaids and the big bad wolf and, of course, Little Red Riding Hood. And he could roam around a world that would change as he progressed through the story. Unlike the first King's Quest, in which you can retrieve the 3 treasures in any order, King's Quest II has a far more linear story that requires you to complete the puzzles in a more structured way. This approach would continue to define the series, but King Graham himself would take some time off. King's Quest III, To Err is Human, would feature a boy named Gwydion in the land of Ludor, who would discover a startling connection to King Graham and head to Daventry to rescue Graham's daughter, Princess Rosella, from a terrible 3-headed dragon. And King's Quest IV, The Perils of Rosella, continued that story as Rosella would embark on a quest to the land of Tamir to find a fruit to heal her dying father. I don't want to tell you any more than that because King's Quest III and IV are really good adventures with some surprising plot twists and even some alternative endings in the case of the latter game. But I will say that when the news broke that King Graham might die and that his daughter would be the hero of King's Quest IV as she worked to save him, gamers of the day were surprisingly on board with the premise. And the game had particularly strong appeal with female gamers, a vastly underserved market in the 1980s. Rosella has long been associated with Roberta Williams as a sort of self-insert into the universe, and while she doesn't look too much like her creator, she certainly has many of the same personal qualities. But even with Rosella's adventure completed, Roberta Williams wasn't done with King Graham. But before we get to King's Quest V, which is where we'll end this episode, I'd like to talk a little bit more about the other games that came out of Sierra's AGI engine. One of those games is The Black Cauldron, based on the 1985 Disney animated film of the same name, which in turn is based on elements of the first 2 books of Lloyd Alexander's Chronicles of Prydain. Roberta Williams and Al Lowe worked together on the design for the game, using the basic framework of King's Quest along with a simplified input system that eliminated the text parser in favor of having players press function keys to conduct actions. The reason for this was to make the game easier for kids to play, but when you play The Black Cauldron today, it's clear that this system is actually a rudimentary form of the same design philosophy that could come to typify point-and-click adventure games down the road. The Black Cauldron is one of my favorite early Sierra games because it makes great use of the artwork and setup of the film to deliver a surprisingly complex adventure with non-linear elements and multiple endings depending upon how you choose to do things. The basic idea is that you, as the assistant pigkeeper Taryn, are supposed to escort the magical pig Henwen to safety before she can be captured by the evil Horned King, who wants to use her power to find the Black Cauldron and create an undead army of Cauldron-born. In the course of the game, you can allow Henwen to be captured, or you can be sneaky enough to get her into hiding with the aid of a fairy. In either event, you'll have to then go to the Horned King's castle and locate a magic sword so you can swap it for the cauldron and then destroy it. Along the way, you can meet the film's other characters, Gurgi, Flutterflam, and Princess Eilenwee. Disney apparently didn't like how non-linear the game was or how the player could die, and fought with Roberta Williams about the game's design. Had it been obvious that the film was about to be a huge flop, perhaps they wouldn't have cared so much. Much like The Dark Crystal, I personally prefer the game to the movie. Roberta Williams also channeled her love of fairy tales into a nursery rhyme-themed adventure game called Mixed Up Mother Goose that released in 1987. The gameplay is extremely simple. You can move in 4 directions and pick up one item at a time by getting close to them until your character actually picks them up. You can also grab animal or human characters and take them with you on your quest to set right the mixed-up nursery rhymes. A sequel called Mixed Up Fairy Tales debuted in 1991, though it and the later editions of Mixed Up Mother Goose were built around the more sophisticated SCI engine. Perhaps the most famous series alongside King's Quest is the Space Quest series, created by Scott Murphy and Mark Crow, 2 Sierra staff members who'd worked together on The Black Cauldron before pitching their own game to Ken Williams. Space Quest starts out quite similarly to Steve Meretzky's Planetfall, right down to having its hero, Roger Wilco, serve as an interstellar janitor. But the game quickly becomes its own thing as Roger, stranded on a desert planet, tries to find a way to get back into space to retrieve the star generator from evil aliens called the Sarians. While the series is itself known for its numerous parodies of science fiction properties, particularly Star Wars and Star Trek, the original game is the most serious and straightforward, with the most famous scene being an alien bar you visit that makes allusions to the Mos Eisley Cantina in Star Wars, while featuring acts such as the Blues Brothers, ZZ Top, and an alien band, the latter of which is replaced by Madonna in the later SCI remake. Space Quest came out in 1986, and Space Quest II, Vohal's Revenge, followed in 1987, providing a popular but notably tougher experience. The series truly hit its stride in 1989 with Space Quest III, The Pirates of Pestilon, an early SCI engine game that's notable not just for its enhanced graphics and music, but also a storyline that allows Roger Wilco to rescue Scott Murphy and Mark Crow, described in-game as the 2 guys from Andromeda, from a software company called Scumsoft that's trying to flood the galaxy with awful games. The satire is strong in this game, particularly when you see cubicles full of programmers being whipped so they can churn out crappy games faster. Oh, and Roger ends the adventure by dropping the 2 guys from Andromeda off with Ken Williams, who gives them a job but sends Roger packing. We'll talk about the other Space Quest games in our next episodes. Another AGI series that was quite prominent was Police Quest, which was created by a retired California Highway Patrol police officer named Jim Walls that Ken Williams had met. While Walls knew very little about computers or adventure games, he knew a lot about police procedure, and he insisted on making a game that required players do things by the book in order to advance. In the first game, 1987's Police Quest in Pursuit of the Death Angel, Officer Sonny Bonds starts out on traffic duty before he stumbles on a trail of clues that lead to a vicious drug ring run by a kingpin named Jesse Baines, aka the Death Angel. This game has it all. A mystery to solve, romance, drama, murder, a shootout, a criminal underworld to explore, and even a donut shop to visit. And it's also so grounded in reality that some police departments reportedly even used it for training new officers. In the 1988 sequel, Police Quest II, The Vengeance, Sonny Bonds joins the homicide department and has to work on tracking down Jesse Baines, who's escaped from prison and who's now seeking revenge on those who put him there in the first place. It's a bit less bogged down in procedural elements, but still quite grounded. As for the other games in the series and the remake of the original, we'll talk about those in a future episode. The Manhunter games probably seem like they're in the same vein as Police Quest, but no, they are definitely not. 1988's Manhunter New York opens in a dystopian New York City where aliens that look like floating eyeballs have taken over the world and have forced everyone to dress like monks and take a vow of silence. It's a deeply weird game that not only involves evading the alien orbs, but also tracking down and stopping a serial killer. The 1989 sequel, Manhunt San Francisco, continues the story but leaves things on a cliffhanger as the villain heads for London. That chapter, unfortunately, never got made. As AGI games go, however, both of these are among the most advanced to run on Sierra's then-aging game engine. A lesser-known AGI game is the 1988 release Gold Rush, a game I actually really like because it allows you to try out 3 different paths as you head out to California in search of gold in the year 1848. You can leave New York by stagecoach and cross the country, but you can also take a ship down to Panama, cross through the jungle and then hop on a different ship, or you can take a really long voyage and head down around Cape Horn to the tip of South America. While the game is not perfect, it is fun. And now our discussion brings us back to perhaps the most infamous of all of Sierra's games from the mid-1980s, Leisure Suit Larry and the Land of the Lounge Lizards, Al Lowe's extremely funny remake of Sierra's earlier text adventure game Softporn Adventure by Chuck Benton, who'd since left Sierra for greener pastures. During Sierra's days as online system, Softporn Adventure had proven to be a good gamble, generating both positive and negative publicity and helping to boost sales during the few months the game was available. But the main reason for remaking the game was that Sierra had lost their license with Disney, and Al Lowe saw some potential in updating it as a graphic adventure using the AGI engine. He joked that the design of Softporn Adventure was so dated, it should be wearing a leisure suit, hence the ultimate concept of the remake. Interestingly, Sierra also licensed the game to a Japanese developer called StarCraft, which made a parallel remake called Las Vegas. If you're familiar with Leisure Suit Larry and play Las Vegas, you'll find essentially the same basic storyline and puzzles, but with none of the charm of Al Lowe's game, which is constantly poking fun at its loser of a protagonist, Larry Laffer, as he attempts to find love in the city of lost wages. In many ways, Leisure Suit Larry is one of Sierra's most impressive adventure games because it has no real sense of urgency to push the player forward beyond the desire to chat up women. It includes many detours and tangents to the nebulous goal, and it allows players to die in humorous ways, including Larry offing himself in despair if the game isn't completed within 7 actual hours. The game also includes a humorous quiz at the beginning to ensure players are old enough to play, and even has a boss key that can be triggered to make the game display a fake graph, humorously depicting a bar chart of condom types. Unfortunately, the boss key also ends the game in the original version, so you'd better save often if you plan to use it to fool your boss into thinking that you're working. The various sequels to Leisure Suit Larry, as well as a VGA remake of the first game, were all developed using the SCI engine, and though the series made it up to Part 7 under Sierra, it also famously has no 4th chapter, creating an intriguing narrative gap between Parts 3 and 5. We will definitely talk more about them in a future episode. Ken and Roberta Williams were major pioneers when it came to PC gaming, and Sierra Online's 80s and 90s catalog is still beloved today because the adventure games they created, starting with King's Quest in 1984, really became something special and enduring. And no game was more special than 1990's King's Quest V, Absence Makes the Heart Grow Yonder, which finally ditched the text parser they'd been using since the beginning and fully embraced a mouse-driven, icon-based graphical interface to replace any hints of nouns or verbs. Well, this was not the first game to provide a point-and-click interface for adventure gaming. It's the adventure that set the standard for the genre's evolution in the 1990s to be driven by icons rather than lists of words. This system became Sierra's go-to for remakes of its aging AGI games like Space Quest, Police Quest, and Leisure Suit Larry, as well as for its 1989 SCI game Hero's Quest, So You Want to Be a Hero, which was renamed Quest for Glory in its 1992 VGA remake. What's more, fans have recreated the first 3 King's Quest games, Space Quest 2 and Quest for Glory 2 in this point-and-click style as well. Competitors such as LucasArts, Access Software, and Westwood Associates also followed suit and imitated this style of adventure gaming. And if you play a modern point-and-click adventure game today, chances are good it's going to be most similar to the style of gameplay King's Quest V established. We'll talk about that game and everything that came after it in our next episode, as well as other adventure games not made by Sierra that pushed the genre forward in different ways. If you enjoy this show, you can read this series every week on my Substack at greatestgames.substack.com, where you'll also find brand new articles on other great games you've never played. And you're always welcome to talk with me on Bluesky. I'm Sean Jordan, I am your great game guide, and I'll be back next week with more to explore. Before I let you go every week, I'll close out the show with a game I want you to try that's a little off the beaten path. This isn't sponsored content, and I don't have any financial stake in anything I recommend. These are games that I think are really good, but don't have as much exposure as some of the more popular ones. This week, I want to recommend Wanderstop, a really incredible 3D adventure from 2025 by Ivy Road about making tea. And while this is described as a narrative-centric cozy game on its Steam listing, It really is an adventure game at heart with very little action but a lot of puzzling about how to solve particular problems. The premise of the game is that you're a world-famous fighter named Alta who flees into the woods after losing a fight and breaking your undefeated streak. You're searching for a master to get you back on your feet, but your sword gets so heavy you can barely hold it. And before long, you pass out exhausted. A large, bald, gentle man named Boro saves you from the forest and brings you to his tea shop, Wanderstop, and asks you to stay and help him serve tea to other people who wander in from the forest. Because you can't lift your sword and you're too exhausted to travel back through the woods yourself, you begrudgingly agree. At that point, the game shifts to a cycle of days where different people with different preferences will come in and you have to figure out how to make the right tea for them. You can grow different plants to get specific flavors, and in some cases, you can also be creative and try to meet their criteria with your own interpretations of what they want. Though this sounds like a concept for a time management game, there's no timer in Wanderstop beyond a couple of recipes that require a little bit of time between steps. And you can take as much time as you want with just about anything that you do. Feel like gardening for a while? You can do it. Would you rather tidy up the grounds and search for items that get left behind by guests? You can do that too. Would you rather take pictures of things and then plaster them up on the walls to decorate the shop? You can not only do it, but the game will give you plenty of opportunities to snap gorgeous photos thanks to its lovely graphics. There's even a series of books to read, a group of penguin-like creatures called pluffins to play with, and lots of no-stakes conversations to be had. The ultimate point of Wanderstop is to consider how you deal with being burned out. And when the game begins to draw to a close, it tries several times to gently discourage you from reaching the end because, if you've been paying attention to its message at all, rolling the credits isn't actually the goal. It's truly about being in the moment and thinking about your experiences, not as a progression to win achievements or earn trophies, but the comforting zen of just doing things you enjoy without a purpose behind the pleasure of the moment. I also want to mention that the game's soundtrack by Daniel C418 Rosenfeld is lovely, and if you're a fan of his other scores to games like Minecraft and Cookie Clicker, you will absolutely love this one too. The Great Game Guide is a podcast written by me, Sean Jordan, and I also wrote the theme music. This is all 100% human-created content. I don't use AI for any part of my production. This episode is copyright 2026 by me, Sean J. Jordan, and you can find more details in the show notes and on my website at greatestgames.substack.com. And credit where it's due. Any games, artwork, sources, or additional music are the property of their respective owners, used under fair use guidelines and also noted in the show notes. If you enjoyed this episode, please let me know on Substack, Bluesky, or with a nice review. But I'd appreciate it even more if you'd share it with a like-minded friend. Thanks for listening!